preservation of and increased access to the 92nd Street Y Humanities Audio Archives is generously funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the fourth lecture in the B'nai B'rith series. Permit me to make a few pertinent and brief announcements. I'd like to call to your attention, of course I'm not certain at the present time whether or not Mr. Ryman is in the front there trying to sell Jewish heritage. But I should like to say very much that if possible, you should get a copy and subscribe to Jewish Heritage. It has been acclaimed in every segment of the Jewish community for its brief, lucid, and provocative articles, and is also ideal for personal reading, discussion groups, schools, and for gift presentations. Our next lecture, ladies and gentlemen, will take place on Thursday evening, March the 1st, at which time Dr. Emanuel Rackman will discuss putting Judaism in practice. Can it be done? A very important announcement is that on Thursday evening, April the 5th, Dr. Cecil Roth, the world-renowned historian, will speak on the topic, The Jewish Community 2000 CE, a Prognosis. Some of the questions he will touch upon: what will the Jewish community be like in the year 2000 CE? What will it be like in the United States, in Israel, on the world scene? In the light of Jewish history, which factors are likely to triumph? Those of assimilation versus those of identification? Will the community of the future be more religiously oriented or less religiously oriented? What should our goals of survival be? The admission for that will be $1. Tonight, ladies and gentlemen, our very capable and astute moderator, Rabbi Arthur Hertzberg, is away on vacation, and I believe he will be back in time for the next lecture. In his stead, the Adult Jewish Education Committee of the B'nai B'rith has invited our very popular and affable and outstanding leader, the president of the Metropolitan Council of B'nai B'rith, to introduce the speaker of this evening's lecture and to act as moderator. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Ben D. Hablum.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good evening, my friends in B'nai B'rith and my friends in adult Jewish education. This is a great privilege for me to act not alone in the stead of Rabbi Arthur Hertzberg, which I will explain, because I am not in his stead. I cannot hope to achieve the illustrious scholarship that is Rabbi Arthur Hertzberg's. And I know, as Dr. Borowitz has said, he misses him, I miss him more. Nevertheless, the fact that the Adult Jewish Education Committee of the Metropolitan Council has accorded me this privilege, it stems only from the importance which B'nai B'rith holds for adult Jewish education. And by reason of this office that I hold, it underscores the reverence that we have for Jewish learning. In this fashion, I discharge my duties as moderator. I will be here, of course, to serve and to introduce Dr. Borowitz. Dr. Borowitz, to many of us in the audience and to myself and to Lou Greenberg, is no stranger. we have been privileged to literally sit at his feet at the Institutes of Judaism at Camp B'nai B'rith, at Spring Valley, and we recall and cherish the fine lectures that Dr. Borowitz gave us and from which we learned so much. Not alone is Dr. Borowitz an outstanding lecturer in Jewish life, but a very well-known author. I can speak for myself and those of us who have read his brilliant article and commentary of last year on crisis theology, and as you know, in our own Jewish heritage, the adult Jewish education publication, Jewish Heritage, where Dr. Borowitz gave us a very fine insight into contemporary Jewish life vis-a-vis Ben-Gurion's stand in his article last December, I think it was, in Who is Israel? You all know from your notices that Dr. Borowitz is the Director of Education, Commission on Jewish Education of the Union of American Hebrew Congregations and Central Conference of American Rabbis. I think that when you have heard Dr. Borowitz, you will know that my introduction has been ample, possibly inadequate, but his speaking will give you all the rest that there should be to know. And so I am very privileged to introduce, with great pleasure, Dr. Eugene Borowitz.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's a great pleasure for me to be here with you this evening, even though I must confess I had looked forward to having Rabbi Hertzberg interrogate me. It takes a little bit of chutzpah to stand before an audience and speak on the subject of God in any case. To have to look forward to such a feat requires both arrogance and the overcoming of one's humility. It was something I looked forward to even more because I had anticipated after I was done having Rabbi Hertzberg ask me all the questions which over his own rabbinic careers people have been asking him about God. Although I must confess my admiration for Rabbi Hertzberg's intelligence and ability is only enhanced now by the fact that of all the weeks of the winter he picked to go on vacation, it was this one. On the other hand, I am happy to see in the audience many old friends. I'm delighted to welcome you here. Whatever questions Rabbi Hertzberg might have had for me, I am certain will be met by equally astute and challenging questions by some of you who have questioned me before, and if not questioned, have teased or otherwise brought me to my proper humility. Now for the balance of this address, let me abandon humility in part and try to speak about modern approaches to God. I want to start by recounting a story to you which is told to us by that famous German Jewish philosopher, Franz Rosenzweig. Rosenzweig reports that once, at a lecture given in Berlin, the famous neo-Kantian philosopher, the great Jew who had revived Immanuel Kant's philosophy at the University of Marburg, one of those first great German Jews who, as a Jew, achieved a place in the academic world of rarefied German scholarship, this same Hermann Cohen was giving a lecture on the concept of God in his philosophy. He gave a brilliant, extraordinary, abstruse, highly logical lecture concerning why we must have an idea of God to bridge the world around us and the moral order within us. And it was such an extraordinary philosophic feat that the audience, which numbered people who, like Rosenzweig, either had or were working on their PhDs, was simply rapt. But Rosenzweig reports that when the lecture was over, an old Jew, I would assume that he had a beard, that he was somehow a little bent, nonetheless an old Jew, the way an old Jew apparently should be, came up to Cohen with tears in his eyes. Rosenzweig claimed he was a witness of this event, and he could not help overhearing what this gentleman said to Hermann Cohen. He said to Hermann Cohen, "Dr. Cohen, I listened to the lecture. I heard everything you had to say about God. But one thing I want to know, where is the Borei Olam? Where's God? Where's the God I know from the prayer book? Where's the God I know from the Jewish tradition? Where is the God who has spoken to my heart? Where is the God that I have had some personal relationship with all these years? You talk about ideas that link two worlds. You talk about great philosophic systems which require a God as a major idea to make them complete. But the God that I know is a God who made the world, a God who created man, a God who spoke to man, who speaks to man. Where is he?" Now that story, it seems to me, is a very touching and an important one, because it says something to everybody who would think about modern approaches to God. Because not everybody needs an approach to God. Some people have God. They know there's a God. They live with God. They talk to him sometimes a little more easily, sometimes with more difficulty. They feel his presence, sometimes very close, sometimes a little more distant. They know in their mind and their hearts and their soul. They know sitting in their house, walking by the way, lying down and rising up. They know that there is a God. Such people are fortunate, extraordinary. They are, in my opinion, to be admired. They don't need an approach to God. They don't need a modern approach to God, because their God is very often the God of the tradition, the God who spoke to their father and their grandfathers and the like. And it is not for people like that a lecture such as this evening's is intended. The man who has the Borei Olam, the man who knows that God is there, he doesn't need approaches new or old. He has God. But the trouble is that most of us today don't. We believe there is a God, and we don't believe there is a God. We know there is a God, and we doubt there is a God. We think there is a God, and we are troubled about God. We are, most of us, somehow unsure, uncertain. And that isn't the kind of relationship one wants with God. One wants to either know that he's there and to live by it, or else to know that he's not there and to change one's life accordingly. That is the modern temper, perhaps even at its best. Perhaps that's the kind of faith that a modern man hopes to rise to when he becomes interested in religion. And some people don't even have that. Some people either know there isn't a God, or are fairly certain that they can't know whether there is a God or not, or realize and understand that everything in their training has made it impossible or at least difficult for them to believe in God. It is because we live in such a time that we require approaches to God. It is because most of us are troubled, and in our troubled state seek to inquire, to think, to feel, to understand, that a question about how we shall approach God, how we know there is a God, what God might mean to us, becomes important. And it is to people like that most of what I have to say tonight is directed. And yet, on the other hand, even Jews who have believed in God have not hesitated from time to time to think about him, to try to understand what it is that they believe. What are the implications of that belief? How does that belief fit in with their lives? How does that belief fit in with what else they know and understand? Perhaps they too need, if not modern approaches to God, to think about God. So whether you come as a believer, or whether you come as a questioner, whether you come as a believer with questions, or a questioner who would like to believe, let us see if we can understand what it seems to me are the major approaches to God which modern Jewish thinkers have taken. I want to limit myself this evening to two. I'm going to rule out Abraham Heschel's approach to God, because it seems to me that Abraham Heschel knows there is a God, and has a God, and speaks of life with that God, but doesn't help most of us who have to find an approach, a way, a means, a direction toward him. I think Heschel has much to say to many people, but not, it seems to me, at precisely this point for the questioner. Leo Beck has something to say about modern approaches to God, but he too starts with a God who's there and is far more concerned to explain what flows if one believes in one God. What are the logical and particularly the moral and ethical implications? So I shall also not speak of Leo Beck. I want to speak of the two men who, it seems to me, give us the major poles, the two great divergent opinions in Jewish life today, and each of whom in his own way charts out a fairly clear and a fairly definite approach to God. And these two men are Mordecai Kaplan and Martin Buber. Let's begin with Kaplan's point of view, not because it comes chronologically first, but because I think it's the most dramatic modern approach to God, the one which in a way is so exciting and thrilling that perhaps it will take us more immediately somehow into the modern period. Then we can come back to Buber's point of view and perhaps compare and contrast the two. Now, Kaplan, as many a modern thinker, before he begins to discuss what God is, wants to make an analysis of why we have trouble believing in God. Why is it, if, as Jews believe, God is everywhere, modern men have such difficulty finding him? Why is it, if the unity of God is so indispensable to our picture of the unity of the universe and the unity of mankind, of races and of nations, that we have such difficulty coming to believe that he's there? Is it because people in our day can't be religious or don't want to be religious? No, says Kaplan. Every man wants to be religious. Because what does religion really mean? Religion is a human system or organization or pattern of living which seeks to take what every person has inside himself and to develop it, to fulfill those latent possibilities of the human being. Is there anyone who does not want to be somehow better than what he is? Is there anyone who does not feel that somehow inside him there are yet possibilities for growth, for development, for moral and spiritual accomplishment, which he has only somehow begun to understand? Therefore, in a way, every man needs a religion in his life. Every man needs to have some opportunity to believe that what is in him is yet to come out and to develop and to flower. And until the last day of his life, he is still a person with plans and goals and purposes. He is still waiting to be fulfilled. And death somehow almost always seems to come too soon. For the search for fulfillment, the search to develop oneself, is a search which goes on all our lives. So everyone really wants to believe. Then why don't people believe? They don't believe, says Mordecai Kaplan, because of the way in which belief comes to them. They're modern people. They're trained in a modern way. People have gone through high school. Most people are beginning to get a chance, if they're young, to go to universities. They're reading books, whether with hard covers or paperback covers or serialized in magazines or in their newspapers. They're thoughtful reading people. They turn on the television set, and the great scientists and philosophers of the day can come into the living room, even if only for a few moments. These people live in this century. And what kind of an idea of God do they get? They get an idea of God which comes to them either through the language of the prayer book or through the language of the Bible. And what do? They take those pictures and images of God which are given to them, and they assume that's what Jews believe about God. God is a king. And what does that mean to a modern man? He doesn't live in a monarchy. He doesn't live in a political system where there is an actual human ruler. And he immediately begins to think of God as something somehow old-fashioned, archaic, as somehow in his mind's eye a great and extraordinary man sitting on a throne, wearing a crown, holding a scepter. He reads in the prayer book on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur how God exercises judgment, how God holds out the staff of the shepherd, and how the people pass by before it like sheep, and he judges each one. There's no need to go on. It's clear enough how many of the images of the Bible and of the prayer book are pictorial, are human, and come from a time years and years ago when people lived in a rather simple, untechnical, and unscientific culture. Can we as modern man accept such an idea of God? No, we cannot, and that's the trouble, because when we begin to think of God, we immediately begin to connect him with those pictures of the Bible and the prayer book, and immediately we say to ourselves, but who can believe that? Believe God is in heaven? We can send rockets up higher than heaven would have seemed to any person in the Semitic world. We can send radio beams far out into the universe. We can construct giant saucers to pull in impulses of radio waves from the galaxies at furthest space. How can one talk about God the way it was talked about in the tradition? And that's our problem. Our problem is that people connect him with the pictures of Bible and prayer book and don't see him in a modern way. And therefore we must do what Jews have done in the past. The picture of God was not static. The way of speaking of him, the images and the language used changed from generation to generation. Anyone who knows the history of Judaism can see that the God who is described walking in the garden is different from the God who is described as seen by Isaiah sitting in the temple with the hem of his garment filling the temple, is different from the God of Deutero-Isaiah who is seen as the creator of the entire universe, is different from the God of the medieval Jewish philosophers who pictured him as an unmoved mover having the world go on its way as he stood above and beyond it all. If Jews in the past have had the courage to take the idea of God and expand and explain it in terms that were meaningful to them in their day, then we must do it in our day. What we need to do is to see to it that God exercises the same role in our lives, that he changes the way we're living, to give us the prodding to become better, that he challenges us to become more sensitive, that he helps us to fulfill everything decent and human and worthwhile in us. And therefore, we must do what our Jewish forefathers did. We must explain the idea of God in terms that will make sense to contemporary man, so that his natural will to believe, understanding that this is what God is, will say, why, of course, that's what I believe and that's what I care about. Then what must we do? We must first of all make clear and simple and specific the fact that God isn't a king, a father, with an arm, an eye, an ear, a voice. We must make clear and straightforward that our God is the God of all intergalactic space, the God of the mighty cosmos, the God who unifies and sets forth everything that man can see through telescope, radio, or light wave, and who brings it all together in a harmony and unity. And therefore we can't say God is a man or a person. How can we describe God in those terms? No, let's use a term that makes sense in our modern scientific language. Let's call God a power, a force, a process like gravity or light, which always works no matter where it is, which works the same. And thus, by immediately and simply calling God a power, a force, by making him impersonal, by ridding him of all the old-fashioned notions which might keep us from believing him, we have suddenly given ourselves a God who is capable of fitting into our picture of the world. But we cannot just let him be a force. Is God just any force in the universe? Is God just a force that somehow operates and unifies? Surely Jews have believed more about God than that. Yes, says Kaplan, we must see to it that that other aspect of God, which has been so critical to the Jewish picture, is brought here into sharp and definite focus. Namely, God is a power, but a power that moves in a certain way. God is a force, but a force with a certain direction or tendency. God is a process, but a process that makes to develop the best and the most able and the most fulfilling and the most significant things in man. In short, Kaplan gives a definition of God. The only major Jewish philosopher in all the history of the Jewish tradition who ever tried to define God. And while Kaplan would agree that this is not really what God is, while he would understand that God is somehow more than any human definition nonetheless, to help us believe, he feels, it is important that we define what we mean by God. And what we mean, he says, what God can mean to us is that God is the power, not ourselves, that makes for salvation. Salvation being understood as human fulfillment, as the growth and development of everything worthwhile in man. And we who reach out to God are saying, in effect, there are forces and processes in the universe upon which I can rely on my development. There are forces in the universe which work through me, taking me and making me better than I am, making me grow, making me develop. And as I, in turn, reach out to understand them, to take them into my life, to link my strength and my force and my energy with those forces, then I somehow become stronger and better and more worthwhile. This is an extraordinary point of view. It's clear. It's definite. It's, in a way, simple and understandable. And it has the marvelous virtue of overcoming that paramount difficulty of belief, namely having an image of God in the mind, which is incommensurate with the rest of what we believe. Kaplan, therefore, has performed an extraordinary service in making it possible for many a Jew in our time who is of a scientific and a technical bent, who believes that the most important things going on in the 20th century are those things which are going on in science. Kaplan has made it possible for a Jew with such an understanding to see his God as part of such a developing and forward-moving universe. And yet there are some problems with this point of view. The problems with this point of view are numerous. We'll mention but two. The first of these is it possible to be religious with an impersonal God? This God has no consciousness. This God doesn't feel. This God doesn't care, to use terrible human language. And from Kaplan's point of view, it's a great advantage that you don't use such human language with regard to God. But somehow religious men have always had the feeling that when they reached out into the universe, there was, so to speak, something in the universe reaching back. That when they responded to what they found in the world around them, whatever it was that they found somehow responded to them. Religion has always been a very personal thing. Now, Kaplan believes that religion can still be personal, but it's only personal from the human point of view. Man takes this idea very intimately. He makes it close to his heart. He holds it in him as something significant and valuable, and in that sense it becomes greatly personal. And it's true that there are many people who have taken Mordecai Kaplan's point of view and been able to feel it as impinging on their own lives, as seeing their own growth and life and struggling and surging forward as somehow linked with such a force in the universe. And yet it certainly changes religion, doesn't it? To say that God is impersonal, to say that God doesn't hear, to say that God isn't somehow present in any sense of presence on his part. And if prayer, therefore, is to be one of the major parts of the Jewish religion, while Kaplan and many of those who follow him find it very easy to pray in some sort of Jewish traditional fashion to this God, others have found it difficult indeed to believe that prayer rather than study, that prayer rather than simply thinking, can somehow take on a meaningful form to an impersonal God. And to mention a second problem, the second problem with Kaplan's God is that Kaplan's God is limited. He's a finite God. He's only part of what's going on in the universe. That God whom Kaplan speaks about is the God who is to be discovered in all those forces in nature making for human good. But what about those forces which don't make for human good? What about all that part of the universe which seems to be rather neutral as far as man is concerned, and some of it positively damaging to man and man's aspect? What about those forces? And Kaplan's answer is precisely, I'm going to give an answer to the problem of evil which is a meaningful answer. God is only that God who is the God of the good. Therefore, when you meet evil in the world, this is the part of the world which the God force in the universe has not yet been able to overcome. No, don't blame God for the evil in the world, because he's not responsible. He's only responsible for the good. God, too, is growing and developing. And we have the faith that ultimately God, the good, will conquer those forces in the universe which are not the good. But we know that God to be supreme. We know him to be the most significant, the most valuable, the most worthwhile part of the universe. When there is evil in the world, we should see it as a job yet undone, a task uncompleted. We should rather feel that we are called upon to join with God to conquer them, to conquer cancer as we have conquered polio, to tame all those rivers who have not yet, like the Tennessee River, been harnessed for human use and human power rather than for damage and for destruction. Evil should be a spur and a challenge to us to move forward, and not, on the other hand, a means for moaning or weeping, and certainly not a means for disbelieving in God. And yet, to whom shall we turn, then, when we are concerned with those forces which do not make for human development in the world? Where do they come from? How can there be a world outside of God? How does it come to be, and how shall we relate to it? If something in the world has nothing to do with God, then to whom shall we turn when we want to discuss it? If God is only responsible for the good, then what do we do when evil comes? To whom shall we talk to about the evil that has befallen us if God is not in charge? At least Job could complain to God and say, God, why do you do this? With Kaplan's God, the book of Job could not have been written, because Job would have been told in advance that God is not involved with the evil. God is only involved with the good. The beauty of Abraham arguing with God that God should not be doing the wrong to Sodom and Gomorrah. The beauty of Job challenging God to do his justice, even though he, Job, in the end must become silent, vanishes when God is no longer responsible. And that unified view of the world, that extraordinary enveloping Jewish religious vision, that somehow everything in the world is ultimately related to one cause, and that even the evil can be turned to his good, is somehow abolished. Mordecai Kaplan's point of view has been appealing to many people. They have found it very significant. And since obviously every approach to God will have its problems, some have found the advantages which Kaplan's way of thinking has brought into their life far outweighing any supposed disadvantages. But let me turn now to a rather diametrically opposed point of view. And this is the point of view of Martin Buber. I do not present it in a way that Buber himself might have used in one of his writings. I'll take something of a detour, if you don't mind, because I think it will make it perhaps a little more plain. Let me go back then to the initial question. The initial question was, why doesn't modern man believe? Why does he find it so difficult to try to understand that there is a God? Why does he find it so difficult to find that God who is somehow everywhere? And Buber and others of his religious persuasion would look about it in an entirely different way. Buber would not say that it's because they're scientific and they don't hear God explained in a scientific way. To the contrary, says Buber, it is because modern man is scientific that he thinks he can treat every question as a scientific question. Science treats everything in the world like an object. It examines it, it takes it apart, it analyzes it, it puts it back together, it explains the procedures and methods by which it works, and thus it hopes to understand it. And therefore, many people coming to religion want to do the same to God. They want to take God apart. They want to know what makes him tick. They want to understand him. They want definitions of him. They want proofs of God. But after all, the great advantage of dealing with an object is that you can control it. When you can take it apart and when you can understand what makes it tick, when you can manipulate it in your laboratory or measure it or test it or prove it or define it or calculate it or conceptualize it, then you're superior to that object. And isn't the reason that we are so fond of science that it has given us control over nature? And isn't one of the major problems of human belief that what we really would like to do is to be able to do the same thing to God? Who wants God bossing us around? Who wants him interfering in our lives? Who wants to be disturbed by God? Therefore, let's turn God into an object. We have a silent conspiracy to use the scientific process and the scientific style because we know that if we can make it work with God, we will have God reduced to an object that we can handle, that we can keep in our control. And as a matter of fact, although we wouldn't like to admit it, and then instead of his being God, we would be God. And isn't that what at his heart every man with all his frustrations and his desire for fulfillment would like to be? Because what could be more fulfilled and more developed and more extraordinarily worked out than to be God? And this is the great sin at the heart of modern man's quest to be religious. It is the effort to try to understand God precisely in so-called scientific terms. It is the effort to transfer to something that is not an object our way of knowing and controlling objects. Is it true that the only thing in the world is objects? Is it true that the only way of knowing in our world is to know something with our senses, with our analysis, with our proof? Is that the only way? Let's take a look for a moment at that place in human experience where we ought to know something else. After all, are you an object? How do you feel when somebody treats you like an object? How do you feel when you don't want to be treated like an object and someone insists on doing so? Have you ever gone to talk to somebody about a matter that was very dear to you, that you really had on your heart, that concerned you so deeply? And while you didn't know whether you wanted to talk about it or you didn't want to talk about it, you knew that you could no longer hold it still. You had to talk about it to somebody. And you had to find somebody that, could really understand. The kind of person who could not only listen with his ears, but with his heart. The kind of person that almost before you started to say what you wanted to say, they would understand. The kind of person that when you left, you would know that they understood even what you couldn't say. The kind of person that you wouldn't feel embarrassed because your words didn't quite come out the way you wanted them to, because you knew that they understood more than the words ever tried to convey. And you go to see them, and you bring yourself to it, and you start to talk, and you are pouring out your heart, and you suddenly notice that they are looking at you to see whether or not your hem is straight, whether or not you had a good shave today, whether or not your fingernails are clean, whether or not you didn't put a little extra smudge of powder on your ear, whether or not the wisp of hair over here near your ear hasn't somehow managed to come out of your hairdo. You're pouring out your heart, and they're examining you. They're looking you up and down. What a terribly frustrating and disturbing experience that is. Why? Because they're treating you like an object. They're not treating you like a person. And you don't want to just be a thing. You want them to pay attention not to your hair, and not to your chin, and not to your clothes, and not to your words, and not to your personality, but to you, to the real you. Because you've finally gotten the strength and the energy to reach out with that real you to them. And they haven't even paid any attention to it. And you know that sometimes it's possible to work the other way. Sometimes when you, out of the depths of your heart, reach out to another person, you find the other person reaching out to you. And what passes in a look, a touch, what passes over the sentences or under the sentences is so marvelously significant. You know that they know what you want them to know. You know that they know that you know what has happened between you. You know that they know that you know that they know. Because there's another way of knowing. There's a way of knowing which isn't a way of knowing just objects, but a way of knowing that is a way of knowing persons. And the two are different. Of course we can know a person as an object, and it's terribly helpful sometimes. If you want to be a doctor, you have to take a person apart. I mean, the poor doctor who doesn't know the difference between an arm and a leg is not the kind of doctor to go visit. The surgeon who knows you're such a person that he can't cut into you is not the man to do an operation. But to only treat persons like objects is one of the major problems of our age. You want to hate somebody? Turn him into an object. You want not to have any responsibility for another man's life? Punch out his data on a card, and all he is a card to you. You can shift him around or move him or do whatever you want to him because the card came up. And you don't have to confront him as a real living individual. And that's the problem with our day and age. The problem with our day and age is we're taking people and turning them into objects all the time. And we know it. We know it, every one of us. We have our own tricks to keep the other person out of our lives. We have our little games, our false faces, our excuses, our roles, our patter. How are you? How are things? How's the wife? How are the children? How's the weather? We have all the games set up. Why? Because we don't want to really get to know the other person. We don't want the other person to get to know us. We want to be too smart. We want to get involved. And that's why we call everybody by his first name. No misters anymore. No respect anymore. Because we have to lie to each other that we know each other. We make believe we're such great friends and buddies. Why? Because we want to make certain that the other person knows that we don't really care about him at all. He's really an object and not a person to us. I've deviated a little bit from God, so it would seem, because I want to show you how important this is for understanding something not just about religion, as if religion were something separated and to be put into a little closet all by itself, or it's something that goes on in a synagogue or a church. It takes place a couple of hours a week. If religion is real, it has something to say for all of life, every day and every moment. And Buber says our major problem is precisely what Kaplan is doing. Our major problem is we want to turn God into an object, and we can't. The only way to get to know God is the way you get to know another person. And you do it by bringing all of yourself to it. All of you. Your mind, of course your mind, but more than your mind. You can't just think about a person. You got to reach out to them with all that you are, and that means you can't watch. Oh, most of the time when we're with people, we're watching. Part of us is talking and participating, very friendly. And the other part is a watcher standing over here, seeing what's going on, making certain. And that's what we'd like to do with God. We'd like to talk to God and then watch to see if he's really there. To find out, to know, to be able to report and say, yes, he was. I found him. But if the watcher is standing out there watching, then it's only part of you. Then the other person only got to meet 60% or 30%. He didn't get to meet you. The only way you can really get to meet another person is if all of you takes part spontaneously and in a fresh way. And that's what religion says. It is not without reason that immediately after declaring that the Lord our God is one, we say, you must love the Lord your God with all your mind? Oh no. With all your heart. And to make sure that you don't misunderstand, we say, with all your soul. And strangely enough, the Hebrew goes on to say, and with all your, and then comes, it's a very strange word, that extra word. It says me'od. Me'od means very. With all your very. With all your whatever is left over after everything else is that too. Of course, the rabbis were very clever when they commented on it. The rabbis said, thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, means you should love God. You should love your Lord your God with all your soul, means even if he takes your soul from you, as he will, you should still love God. So what about with all your might? Oh, the rabbi said that's obvious. That means with all your money. Because there are some people to whom money is more important than either their heart or their life. Therefore, whatever is left over and whatever you don't want to hold back, whatever you want to keep back, that too you should love God with. That's our problem. If we want to find God, we'll find God. It's like getting to know other people. You got to bring your whole self to it. And then you don't have to be any place special or do anything special. Reach out and you'll find him. Reach out to that God who is around us at every moment, and you will find God. And not with any mystic experience, as in the movies, with violins in the background and pigeons and the clouds opening up and the sun coming out. How foolish. What happens when you get to know another person? Nothing. It comes and it goes. It can be someone on a subway platform. All of a sudden, he's talking to you, you're talking to him, and when you leave, you say to yourself, never realized he was such a nice person before. Never realized there was anything there under that exterior. Or it can be someone you know very well, but it comes and it goes. No great mystic explosions or tremendous thrills. No great emotional kick. Just as natural and as simple as being a person. And that's the way it is with God. As a matter of fact, says Buber, we not only know God simply and directly, but whenever we really know another person, whenever we reach out to another individual for what he is in his own very specific and personal way, and whenever we, with what we are, with our limitations and our talents, with our abilities and our frustrations, whenever we in our individuality reach out to him, and whenever we have that sense of meeting, we know something more than just the other person. We know that this is a world in which there are persons, in which it is just as real and somehow even more real to know that there are persons rather than to know that there are simply objects. We know that there is something in this world which makes persons possible. And more than that, we know that it is possible for us, even though we are isolated single human beings, to reach out to another person and to find them. How do we cross that gap? How do we manage to communicate? How do we reach? Because when we reach, we are reaching somehow not in space. But how shall I say it otherwise? We are reaching through God, so to speak. There is a great subject of all subjects, the only one who may not be turned into an object. Thou shalt not make a graven image. The only one who may not be turned into an object, and it is because he is there in the universe that we can reach out one man to another, and with him, so to speak, as the background, as the ground, as the context, as the area of our meeting, we come to know him. There are two approaches to God, says Martin Buber. One is through knowing other people in this real person-to-person way. The other is by meeting God. You can't plan it, you can't force it. It's like going to somebody to talk to them and sometimes finding them not there. And yet it sometimes happens in a way that when you least expect you're going to talk to somebody, the veriest stranger the bartender, the elevator operator, the grocery man, your casual friend, all of a sudden they're there. God is met almost by chance, in a way, if you're open to him. And Buber says God can be met in either of these two ways. And the extraordinary value of this point of view is that it understands why the tradition used the language it did. When it called God a king, it wasn't because they thought God was a king, but because someone, having had this experience, said, how am I going to describe what I just lived through? How am I going to find words to talk about it? Because I couldn't watch. And I know that this person that I met, this other subject with whom I had this relationship, is somehow greater and more and superior and wiser and deeper and more sensitive than I. And so he said, I'll call him king. Or he called him father. Or he talked about him in ordinary human language because he knew that what lies at the heart of real human relations is what lies at the heart of the relationship between man and God. Buber helps us understand what lies at the heart of the Jewish tradition. Not because we take the language literally, because Buber knows that it's not the language which is given. What you have when you have an experience like this is the other person. When two people love each other, they don't have to tell each other what to do. As a matter of fact, if you have to tell the other person what to do, it's sometimes too late already. And that goes double for Valentine's Day and Mother's Day and Father's Day. Those presents we don't need. It's not the language that counts, it's the relationship. Therefore, we're not going to get tripped up by the language of the Bible or the language of the prayer book. What we want to know is what kind of a relationship can make such language meaningful. What can we feel out of this? And it certainly makes traditional religious experience and feeling possible. Can one have a personal relationship to such a God? With Buber's God, how can you have an impersonal relationship? If it's impersonal, it's not God. Unless that God is God who is somehow near to you, who is a God that you bump into from time to time, it isn't God at all. And Buber explains that other extraordinary phenomenon, namely that half the time we believe and half the time we don't believe. Because if we take love as the closest analogy to this kind of relationship, we would come to understand that for any two people who are in love, dear friends, parents and children, husband and wife, any relationship of this kind, one cannot always be on the person-to-person level. Unfortunately, because that's the way the world goes. Most of the time, we're not on the person-to-person level. Most of the time, we are living with one another simply as objects. And therefore, when we say we love, we mean that some of the time we don't have the experience which ties us together and binds us together. But we say we are in love because we have had those moments of understanding, and we know those moments of understanding will return. And if, God forbid, they don't return, this is why the Jewish tradition permits divorce. Because it knows that when the moments of meeting and encounter and understanding do not return, then the relationship is destroyed. But we don't set up the false expectation like the Hollywood movies do or the young teenagers do, that we shall somehow be able always to remain on the level of rapture and ecstasy, completely and wondrously involved. No. We know that from time to time we shall have these moments of understanding. And therefore, when the moments of misunderstanding or just the moments of living side by side come along, we'll be able to take them in. And that's what it means to have faith in God. To have faith in God means not always to have God with one, not always to be able to hold on to God as if he were a club, a broom, a possession, an object, because he's not a possession, an object. You can't hold on to a person. No, it means to know God at moments. And therefore, at the moments when God is not there, to have faith that other such moments will return, that the experience which has been there will come back from time to time. For a modern man to have faith, says Buber, is both to believe and to have moments of disbelief, but to understand the moments of doubt within the context of those deeper moments of understanding. To be sure, there are problems with Martin Buber's point of view. How do you explain this to a man who never had such an experience? Who says, I heard everything you said, but I don't know, nothing like that ever happens to me. How do you explain it to a person who says, it's so different from everything else that I do all day long? So different from my way of life, from my way of thinking. I don't know, I don't look inside myself so much. I mean, if you can really explain it to me, then I'll believe it. That's a terrible problem. It's such a terrible problem, as a matter of fact, that when Buber talks about it, he doesn't even try to say it in what I hope has been the logical fashion that I've tried to present it tonight. He talks about it like poetry. He writes little emotional, feeling sentences, little short paragraphs which are supposed to evoke the feeling and the like, because he knows he can't describe it to you. If he described it to you, he would be describing person to person as if it were an object. He would be trying to see a personal relationship as if it were a person-object relationship. You can't do that. So one of our problems is communication. One of the great problems with Martin Buber's philosophy and understanding is, how do you explain it to somebody else? And the answer is that if you can't explain it to him with words, you'll live it with him. You'll live with him long enough as friend and colleague and companion until you manage to create with him the knowledge and understanding that not everything in this world is objects, but that there are persons in the world, and this is the most important part. And there is a second problem, and it's Kaplan's problem. And it's why there are many Jews who to this day are still convinced that Kaplan's solution is the better solution, and that is, but how is one going to understand a God like this as the God of the entire universe? I can understand that I have intimate relations with people, and I'm a little more sensitive to them, and I come across them in somewhat different ways. But to say that any little feeling or emotion which passes through my body is somehow that God who fills the entire universe? To say that that God who fills somehow and manages and unifies and carries out all of the cosmos is somehow personal, relates to me the way I relate to other persons, I don't even understand a thing like that. I can't imagine such a thing like that. I can't picture such a thing like that. I can't believe such a thing like that. And it's a very important and damaging criticism. Of course, Buber would say, stop picturing. Stop trying to reduce it to conceptual terms. Don't turn it into an object. Don't think it, relate to it. So have I given you back the Borei Olam? Do you conclude this discussion with some feeling that somehow, while people play with ideas, God is somehow missing? I hope not. I hope that you can see in the effort of these two great Jewish philosophers, a modern man searching, striving, probing effort to use all of his capacities, whether it's only his mind or whether he reaches beyond his mind to his total self, to understand the world in which he finds himself. I think they have something to say to us. I think each of them has something important to say. I don't think you can believe both Kaplan and Buber. I think sooner or later, if you want to be reasonably logical and consistent about your point of view, you have to take either one or the other. And I hope that it might be possible for you, through hearing this discussion of the two men, to make your own feelings about God somehow a little more rich, a little deeper, a little more profound. But I hope you get one more thing out of the lecture. How extraordinary a thing it is that in the Jewish religion, two men can take two different ways of trying to approach God, and neither one excommunicates the other. Kaplan does not say, Buber is not a Jew, I don't understand that point of view about God. And Buber does not say, Kaplan is not a Jew, how can a person have such a mechanical notion of God? No. Each of them knows that God is more than any system, that God is somehow beyond our efforts to explain him. Each has sufficient humility to say, this is the best I've been able to come up with, but God is obviously more than that. And each, therefore, says our Jewish tradition is right in saying Think, search, look, reason. Work it out for yourself. God is so great that we must continue in every generation to spread out our ideas, to make them more comprehensive and more adequate. And this is the virtue of your tradition. Oh, yes, there are things in the Jewish religion that one needs to do more definitely. But here is a tradition which says you can grow in your religious ideas. We will help you grow. You have freedom in your way of thinking about this most critical problem, but we will help you make it as rich and as meaningful a freedom as it can be. Here is a tradition which does not force upon you what you must believe about God, but encourages, stimulates, and challenges you through its great men to your own great ideas.
I intimated in my introduction that no matter what titles of biography I would recite would be inadequate to Dr. Borowitz. And I think after hearing the brilliance, the fluency of thought and word which Dr. Borowitz presented tonight is proof that any description or further biography would be most inadequate. I think that he has brought a beauty, a clarity to the most profound area of thought that meets most of us. And as I have heard Dr. Borowitz before, I don't think I've ever heard him as dramatic, and I guess you agree with me because as I watched you, I forgot I was in an auditorium. Am I right? Thank you, Doctor. I have seen Dr. Borowitz in lighter moments, but he has made a very serious impact on me, and I guess he's probably done the same for most of us here tonight. He's presented two opposing thoughts. And if I ever wished that Rabbi Hertzberg were here, it's this moment. But I think that in whatever question will be posed, you can depend on Dr. Borowitz to bring Rabbi Hertzberg along with whatever answer he'll have. Shall I call for the question? I see that our Commissioner for Adult Jewish Education is well enough to be with us tonight, and Harry Waterston. Good to see you, Harry.
I would like to know what your concept of God is.
Harry, you make it very easy for me this evening. It's much too simple for me. I think Buber has explained in a way which I have, as a young man and an older man, been searching for a long time. I find Buber to be the most adequate and significant explanation of God I know. I find that with regard to questions concerning God, the more I understand Buber, the more I understand my own relationship with God. Therefore, with very, very modest kinds of small adjustments in which I am willing to be humble yet and learn more about Buber, as far as I am concerned, Martin Buber has clarified and deepened my own way of looking at God. Now that, you notice, is not a concept of God, because when you have a subject, you don't turn a subject into a concept. Since you won't ask me the concept of my wife or the concept of my mother-in-law, Ke'ena Hora, I assume, therefore, that if I understand God as I understand another person, I don't have to give a concept. But what I have learned from Buber is an approach and an understanding and a relationship, and that's what I believe.
The gentleman on my left. I can't see from here.
Dr. Borowitz, I didn't recall you're speaking about Buber's interpretation of the forces of evil. Could you help us on that, please?
Did everybody hear the question?
The question was Buber's interpretation of the forces of evil. I made such a point of the limitation of Kaplan's point of view with regard to the forces of evil that it would have been at least fair for me to indicate in what way Buber is more helpful or less helpful with regard to the forces of evil. Buber makes a great point of discussing how much of evil arises out of human freedom. That is to say, the fact that man is free to reach out to other people, free to act and the like. It is man's freedom which is the source of almost all the evil man meets in the world. If the Jews are killed in Europe, it is because some men use the freedom given to them to be malevolent instead of using it for goodness. If there is difficulty and danger in the relationship between nations, it is because of the abuse of freedom. And yet, that can't be all the explanation. Someone has to somehow reach to a greater depth and profundity in terms of the kind of evil that we have in the world. Why is it then that we are given a freedom which allows us to be so demonic? Buber says we understand everything which we meet in the world as somehow related to God. And in whatever we meet and whatever we touch, we need to try to find God in it. And real evil, says Buber, is when at any given moment we turn to God, and when we have reached out with all our heart, with all our soul, and with all our might, and we find him absent. That is what it means to have evil in the world. Now at that point, where it seems that there is no God, this is where faith comes in. Why? Because we can't find him. Because the meeting which we, like Job, would like to have to resolve our questions and our doubts is missing. And that's what's the greatest evil. The Bible puts it in a very interesting and peculiar way. It says God hides his face. He takes away his presence. This is what is evil, says Buber, that God is sometimes hidden, that he disappears. But, says Buber, even though we do not know or understand, and even though we are left so utterly bereft and so despairing in that, one thing remains. We remember that it was not always so. And even at that moment, knowing that God could also have been found somehow here, we wait for him to return, because he is not always here, and because ours may be the grace in the next moment, or the moment after, or the moment after that to find him again. It is not that God has no relationship to the evil, it is that God cannot be found, which makes it evil. But it is our hope that God will be found again, because we have found him in the past, that makes it possible to live with it. We do not ever know why the evil is here. But Buber at least gives us a way both of living with it, of understanding it, and hopefully even enduring it.
I think it's Martha Tura. We can't hear you otherwise.
I'm not saying this to be facetious, Rabbi Borowitz, but aren't titles like Modern Man's Approach to God meaningless? Because I think the approach to God, or the search for God, was the same for medieval man as it is for modern man. Because first you tell us, I don't want to make this a speech, but I want to get to the point. First you tell us about Kaplan and his approach, and then you destroy the approach because you say there are things, concepts that don't gel. And then you tell us about Buber, and there are also things that we can't square. Wouldn't you say that the modern man's search to God is strictly a personal one? I mean, that the only way we can search for God is by ourselves, with our own faith and reason and understanding. I don't think we can do it through anybody else's understanding.
And Dr. Hertzberg didn't plant that question either, Dr. Borowitz.
Well, I would most respectfully disagree. Seems to me that anything important that goes on in human life, we ought to try to benefit from what other people know and understand. If I want to paint, I don't just go buy me a set of paints and begin to paint as if I'm the only person that ever painted in the world. If I want to be a musician, I don't just begin to go and play my own music. If I'm interested in literature, I just don't sit down and write my own poetry. Now, these are all intimate and highly personal forms of expression. But what I do is I try to benefit from the people who went along before me. Now, in one respect, we want to benefit from the fact that we have had a Jewish tradition which goes before us for some 4,000 years. You are right to the extent that there have been Jews before us who have also been looking for God, who have also had troubles, who have also had difficulty in a very personal way. But they've accumulated experience. And it wasn't just intellectual experience. It wasn't little articles in learned journals which never came out of the library and no one ever read. These were people who had to live through history, through oppression, through persecution. They lived in almost every major country of the Western world. They've lived under kings. They've lived under caliphs. They've lived in a feudal society. They lived in an industrial society. And in all of this, they've tried to understand what it means to believe in God. Now, it seems to me that they have something to teach us, just simply out of their experience, but more than that. I happen also to believe that some people are smarter than other people. At least I find it that way. And if, therefore, in a given field I want to learn something, I try to go to those people who are considered to be the smartest people. Now, they may not turn out to be the smartest people, and as I said in the Jewish tradition, you are encouraged on your own to do everything that you can. Nobody wants to take it away from you. But if you and I really find ourselves smarter than Buber and Kaplan, then what we ought to do is to contribute so that other Jews can benefit. And not only other Jews, mankind as well. No, I think it is very important in terms of our personal faith to struggle and search through the writings of other men, always, of course, coming back to the person and working his own way out. It seems to me Kaplan should be very helpful to people who can't believe in God because they think he's an old man with a beard, or because they think that that's what Jews think God is, that they take the God of the prayer book literally. I think Kaplan's done us a great service. On the other hand, I think Buber has done us, from my point of view, an even greater service. Because once you begin to realize that God isn't a man, and that you mustn't take the things that it says about him as a man as if they are objectively true, once you know that he's not a man, you can understand that he's a person.
I think it's Max Friedman, and then I'll recognize the gentleman in the center row.
Dr. Borowitz, I'm going to ask, maybe it has no relation to the question, but what motivates one to become religious in the stage of God? Is it fear or the aspiration of a hereafter?
Well, that's a pretty broad question, what motivates one. I don't think either does. The old traditional theories were that primitive man was scared by the world around him, and as a result, in order to protect himself, he invented a god. Another theory was that primitive man was frightened of death, and in order to escape from his fear of death, he decided to believe in God. Now, if you don't want to believe in God, those are two good theories for not believing in God. In other words, it's generally people who don't want to believe in God and who don't have any real religious experience who use these as the normal examples. Now, obviously, there is a difference even among cultural anthropologists as to how religion started. I would refer you to a couple of magnificent books by E.O. James, one called Prehistoric Religion and another one called The Religion of Primitive Man, I believe. It's the first volume in the Putnam History of Religions. It's a superb book on the growth and the development of religion. And he discards both of those theories. But I don't know if we really care about what started primitive man off. I think you and I ought to talk about why you and I ought to think about questions of religion. I mean, if you want to start, because death suddenly makes clear to you that you are limited, and that you need to know something about why it is that you are here and where you're going, and whether it's worth working so hard. I mean, if you've only got X number of years to live, may it be till at least 120, of course. But if you've only got 40 or 60 years to live, why bother with half the things you're doing? I mean, if death is really there, and the one reality of life is that we are going to die, And not only are we going to die, but we don't know when we're going to die. Why should we do most of the things we're doing? Or to put it the other way around, man is not self-explanatory. A man with his strivings and his ambitions and his goals, even what he learns from his father and mother and what the society teaches him and what the mass media pour down his poor, unthinking consciousness, man is somehow more than that. He has purposes which transcend his own immediate life, his own immediate interests. He can't explain what it means to fulfill himself because he has no yardstick in himself to judge what he himself fulfilled will be. I want to be more than I am, but what should that be? I can't look at myself and find out because I'm not what I ought to be. Then how can I be what I ought to be? Only if there's an ought to be outside me, which is the standard against which when I measure myself, I see to myself, I am not what I ought to be. There are many ways people come to religious questions. I think the most meaningful one today in our day is that we don't explain ourselves. We thought we did, particularly in the 30s when everything was either politics or psychoanalysis or science. Today we begin to realize that some of the most healthy psychoanalyzed scientists who are in government still don't know the difference between right and wrong. And that's the problem. The problem is, why do we believe what we believe? Why do we care about what we care? Where do we get the sense that anything is important? That, it seems to me, is the question that religion answers, and that in a confused and difficult and darkening world is the kind of question which religion exists to answer.
Thank you. The gentleman in the center aisle.
Dr. Borowitz, you just answered these gentlemen over here is more or less what I wanted to ask you in the main. But I also have another question to ask you allied to that. Do you believe that rather than the approach to God is actually a God's approach to man that should be actually discussed in its true significance, regardless of Buber or regardless of any other person's writings? I mean, I believe that since God is the greater power, we are the finite power, and he has more or less fashioned us to be what we cannot even hope to realize that we shall become. Therefore, the only definite words that we have as to commands of how to act in this life is the Torah, as the basic writings, and the Bible becomes a universal instrument for the whole race of man to follow if it's going to have any significance, that mankind has any significance in this world, regardless of what role we are actually to play. Therefore, the idea of whether we believe in a hereafter or what the hereafter may be should not actually be our concern, because whatever is going to evolve will evolve regardless of semantics or regardless of our own.
Excuse me. I won't understand the question,
the question,
but I don't.
I'm sorry, I got it. It's all right.
So would you repeat the question, please?
I guess it's just a rambling thought, more or less.
Would you repeat the question, please?
I'll give a rambling answer. Listen.
The question
Do you
is,
get the question?
Yes, I have it.
Is what I'm saying have any significance based on your experience of thought?
Thank you.
I didn't have a chance to discuss Heschel's point of view. Perhaps you recall what that marvelous, extraordinarily lyrical book of Abraham Heschel's on the Jewish religion is called. It is called God in Search of Man. God is going around looking and nobody's paying any attention. Now, Heschel can call his book that, but that's the reason why I didn't discuss Heschel, namely, that if you believe in God and you know that God is there, then it's quite clear, since you know that God is there, that God has somehow made himself known to you. Otherwise, how would you know? That God has somehow been that kind of God who has reached out to people. And therefore, since you know that he's there and you know that he's real, instead of talking about it from a human point of view, a limited, small, tiny point of view, why don't you talk about it from his point of view? Instead of talking about it, man's approach to God, and who is man to approach God? Oh, but look at the chachma, look at the sense, look at the seichel of it, that God goes looking for people. Marvelous. But the trouble is, you have to really know that there's a God to say that. You have to be so sure and so certain that you can turn all the questions around and start from God. Now, if you have that good fortune and what really in a way is mazel tov, the grace to do it, if you really have, listen, for all I know, he's refuting me. You know, if you have that good fortune to really know in that way that there is a God, then you can talk from the other point of view. And that's the beauty of Heschel's position. But I can't do it. I am afraid, like what seems to me the general situation of modern man, I can't start with God's existence as a certain and a sure and a known thing and then explain everything from God. I have to start with my questions. And even though my questions may lead me somewhere, the reason that I got to where I got was because I asked what I asked and I looked. Now, maybe that's not quite true. Maybe I asked what I asked was because I knew there was something there to find. Maybe in a dim, unconscious way, I knew he was there all the time. The problem was to find a way to get to him. But the problem was that I didn't know how to get to him. And therefore, instead of talking with assurance about what he does, what he says, how he acts, what he wants, I will be more humble. I will start with what I know about him, what I think he wants of me, how I can reach up to him. And that's the best I can do. This, by the way, is primarily the difference between the Orthodox and the non-Orthodox temperament. The Orthodox temperament, I'm not talking about synagogues or organizations now. The Orthodox temperament says God has told us. There is a God and he told us. And the non-Orthodox temperament says, we believe there is a God, and we believe that we can know what he wants us to do. But it's we who have to come to know him, and we who have to reach, even though we hope he is there meeting us. Now, there's a big difference between saying God told us and we found out, between saying God gave us the information, and we, through coming to meet him, have come to understand what he wanted of us. And that's why the liberals feel free to change, and the traditionalists do not feel free to change.
We look for a final question. The lady on my right, here in the center aisle.
I would like to make a question. You have pointed out to two approaches to God. Could you relate those two approaches to Judaism? I mean, listening to you, somehow I missed the relationship between those approaches and Judaism. They seem to be two nice philosophical theories.
The question is perceptive and correct. Jews believe that there is one God for all mankind. As long as you only talk about God, you don't yet necessarily talk about the Jewish religion. Now, it so happens that the points of view which I have presented here are not points of view which could be accepted by every religion. Not every religion in the world which believes in one God could accept what Kaplan and Buber say. There are certain Jewish tinges and certain Jewish emphases and a certain Jewish stance in what these men set forth. But one begins to see the Jewish side of the religion, not just in understanding God, but in understanding the relationship between God and the Jewish people. It is true that Judaism evolved a certain understanding of God. But the only way you see that understanding of God in terms of the Jewish religion is when we talk about the Jewish people. Because other people other than Jews can know God. One doesn't have to be a Jew to know God, even from the standpoint of the Jewish religion. Therefore, one can spend an evening like this talking about God and talking about the things which Jews and non-Jews share alike according to the Jewish religion. But if we want to get down to Jewish practices and Jewish theory concerning the Jewish people, if we want to get around to the Jewish way of life, then we have to introduce a new element. And it is the element called the people Israel, the Jewish people. Because this God was known by this people, and it is this people which lives out its relationship to that God through what we know as the Jewish way of life, through Torah in the broadest possible sense. So therefore, what you are asking me, and in a way I take it as a sign of the success of the lecture, all right, now we have God. But now we need to go on to Israel so we can get to Torah. And that's correct. Except that tonight is only modern approaches to God, and we shall have to wait for another evening to modern approaches to Israel and Torah.
Dr. Borowitz, I think that now is the time to reopen the question period. But as you said, it will be another lecture for which I hope we will be privileged to attend. I want to say that I have been indebted to you for a great learning experience, and I think that I speak for each and every one, and I pay tribute to our chairman for this wonderful evening to permit me up here. Thank you, Lou.
Thank you, Dr. Borowitz. Thank you, Mr. President. And ladies and gentlemen, remember, 2 weeks from tonight, Dr. Emmanuel Rackman. Good night.
Thanks for listening. For more information on the 92nd Street Y, New York, and all of our programs, please visit us at 92ny.org.